Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. It started like any other celebration. Lights, drinks, laughter, music pulsing through the center of a small Colorado town. But by morning, one person had vanished, without leaving behind a single scream, a single mark, or a single trace. It was a chilly March morning in Longmont, Colorado. The streets were quiet. The party lights were off, and one woman, Rita Gutierrez Garcia, was gone. No scream, no struggle, just silence. A mother of three disappeared without a trace after a night out. And for 3 long years, not a single soul could answer the one question that haunted this town. What happened to Rita? Sometimes, the silence speaks louder than the screams. Rita Gutierrez Garcia wasn't a stranger to downtown Longmont. She knew the streets. She grew up in the community. She was a 34-year-old mother studying to become a counselor, balancing school, parenting, and her own healing journey. Her life hadn't been perfect, but she was fighting forward. On March 17, 2018, she met with friends to celebrate St. Patrick's Day at a local bar called Threes. It was the kind of night people usually forget: plastic beads, green hats, generic drinks, packed sidewalks. But for Rita, it would be the last time she was seen alive. Just after 2:30 a.m., surveillance footage showed her standing outside the bar, talking on her phone. It was cold. She was waiting. She said goodbye to a few people and stepped away into the dark. That's where the footage ended. There was no physical altercation, no bystander reports of a struggle. No visible signs of distress. Rita's car remained parked. Her purse was never found. Her phone went dark minutes later. The case didn't begin with a body. It didn't even begin with a scene. It began with a silence and a growing sense that something was very wrong. By mid-morning, her mother Diane grew anxious. Rita hadn't returned home. She hadn't contacted her children. No texts, no calls. And that, everyone agreed, wasn't like her. By noon, family and friends began making calls. They drove to the bar, talked to bartenders, scanned the streets where Rita might have walked. There were no signs, no shoes in a ditch, no purse on a bench, just the same quiet that had settled over Longmont before dawn. That afternoon, a missing persons report was filed. The responding officer noted the lack of obvious red flags: no history of mental illness, no drug use, no domestic incidents that would suggest Rita ran away. It wasn't just a walk-off. It felt off. But without witnesses, injuries, or crime scene indicators, law enforcement had little to go on. There was one frustrating truth about this case from the very beginning. Rita had disappeared in public, in proximity to dozens of people, cameras, lights, and yet there was nothing usable, no high-resolution footage, no witnesses who saw her get into a car, and no definitive location where anything had actually happened. What investigators had was a window, a digital window, narrow but critical. Using call logs and cell tower data, they established a final ping, 2:42 a.m. The phone disconnected while moving northeast from the bar, then stopped. After that, silence. That narrowed the possible area. But in the early hours of March 18th, without clear signs of a crime, police couldn't secure search warrants to dig into private property. They canvassed the area. They checked dumpsters, nearby fields, parking lots. Still, no trace of Rita. They went back to the bar, questioned staff, interviewed patrons who might have interacted with her. Some remembered seeing her near a white truck, but couldn't describe the driver. Others said she'd been waiting for a ride. One person even suggested she might have left with someone she knew. The problem: hearsay didn't make for probable cause, and without probable cause, no one could be detained. No property could be searched. No vehicles could be seized. Longmont wasn't used to cases like this. It's the kind of town where people still wave at each other from across the street, where disappearances were for fiction or out-of-state news cycles. The Rita Gutierrez Garcia case felt like a rip in the local fabric, and the longer she was missing, the wider the tear grew. A community search began almost immediately. Volunteers, dogs, drones, flyers posted in grocery stores, gas stations, school bulletin boards. Candlelight vigils were held. Banners printed with her name. But time passed, and the silence continued. And then came the first clue that something darker might be behind it all. During interviews, multiple women mentioned a man at the bar that night, a man who'd been seen following women in the past, who made some uncomfortable, who, some believed, had been there the night Rita disappeared, but no one remembered his name, and none of the women could prove he'd spoken to Rita. Still, one note stuck. He left town right after that night. 3 weeks later, a tip came in, anonymous, vague. It read, "Check the man with the white truck. He's not from here anymore." The vehicle match was thin, but it was the first moment the investigation turned from missing person to possible abduction. There was still no crime scene, no blood, no weapon, nothing for forensics. Just a woman missing, a phone gone dark, and a truck that might have held the answers, but police had nothing actionable, not yet. Looking back, one investigator would later say, the problem wasn't just the silence, it was how clean everything was. Too clean. The phone was off. The last ping was in a dead zone near commercial lots and undeveloped acreage. No traffic cameras in that pocket, no neighboring surveillance, no lights. It was almost like someone had planned it. The early stages of a missing persons case are always fragile. What you do or don't do in the first 48 hours can determine whether it becomes a recovery or a cold file. For the Gutierrez-Garcia investigation, those hours slipped by fast. March 18, 2018. By late afternoon, Rita's family had filed an official report with Longmont Police. The responding officer noted no immediate red flags for voluntary disappearance. No history of mental illness, no active domestic disputes, no sudden withdrawals of cash or property. In fact, Rita had plans scheduled that week: childcare drop-offs, a counseling appointment, and classes. All of it abruptly missed. Her phone was off. Not out of battery, off. Investigators ran the first standard checks. Credit card activity, none, after 11:38 p.m. on March 17th. Bank transactions, dormant. Her vehicle, still parked near the bar, no tow reports, no damage. Her purse was not recovered with the car, and neither were her house keys. The only viable lead came from her cell tower ping at 2:42 a.m., just minutes after she was last seen on camera outside Three's Bar. The signal originated near an industrial corridor northeast of downtown Longmont, a pocket of undeveloped land surrounded by storage units, fenced lots, and vacant commercial property. This would later become a critical forensic zone, but at the time, police didn't have the authority to search any private parcels without evidence of a crime. They were looking for a person, not a suspect, not a body. The area was canvassed visually. Patrol vehicles circled nearby roads. Officers on foot looked for discarded belongings, signs of struggle, blood, drag marks, anything. Nothing stood out. The ground was dry. No rain to erase evidence. But there was also nothing left behind. The lack of a defined crime scene created a problem that would persist for months. Technically, Rita was just missing. On March 19th, law enforcement issued a bolo, be on the lookout, to neighboring jurisdictions for any signs of Rita, alive or deceased. Coroners across state lines were alerted. No Jane Does matching her physical description were located. The national database came back empty. Longmont PD brought in digital forensics specialists to analyze Rita's social media and message history. Her last known messages were casual exchanges with friends and a brief phone call to her mother shortly before closing time. Nothing in tone, language, or behavior suggested fear, conflict, or intent to disappear. Several friends who had been with her that night were re-interviewed. They described her as sober, coherent, and emotionally stable. No reports of fights, no indication she was distressed or planning to meet someone she didn't know. But one inconsistency appeared. Some friends recalled Rita mentioning she was waiting for a ride, while others believed she planned to walk home. There was no Uber or Lyft record tied to her phone. No dashcam footage from passing vehicles surfaced. And unlike major cities, Longmont lacked real-time traffic cam coverage in the area where she disappeared. By March 21st, the community launched its own search. Flyers were distributed across Boulder County. Search parties combed trails, fields, riverbanks. Police dogs were deployed but hit no scent trail beyond the bar's immediate block. No one could explain how a woman could disappear from a commercial district with no trace. It was like she dissolved, one volunteer later told local press. She was there, and then she wasn't. At the time, the working theory was abduction. But there was no vehicle description, no suspect profile, no confirmed witness account placing her inside a car. And without those elements, no Amber Alert could be issued. Rita was an adult, with no confirmed foul play. On March 23rd, detectives reviewed surveillance from nearby businesses. A gas station camera 1 block away showed a white pickup truck turning eastbound around 2:40 a.m. The timestamp fit the cell phone ping window. The image was blurry, the license plate unreadable. Still, that white truck became a focal point. A patrol bulletin was issued requesting tips on anyone driving a similar vehicle that night. Leads trickled in, none verifiable. At this stage, there was no forensic evidence tying any vehicle to Rita. No recovered fibers, no DNA, no recovered belongings that could be tested. The truck could have been a coincidence. But in low-light cases, patterns often emerge from fragments. And this fragment lingered. Investigators pulled employment and criminal background records for men in the area with registered white trucks. One name appeared, unrelated to any current open warrant, but linked to a prior assault charge from 2017 in another state. But without direct evidence or probable cause, the name stayed in a file, not on a warrant. This was the kind of case that made detectives nervous. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was quiet. Too quiet. Every time they thought a pattern was forming, the next step yielded nothing. A local investigator described it like chasing a shadow across a wall that had no texture. By the end of March, 2 weeks after Rita was last seen, the search officially expanded to out-of-state contacts. Detectives cross-referenced border crossings, hotel check-ins, even digital purchases in neighboring cities. Nothing matched. Rita had vanished from a public street in a populated town during a busy night, and not a single piece of verifiable forensic material had emerged. That absence in itself became suspicious. In cases of spontaneous disappearances, overdoses, voluntary departures, suicide, there are usually digital breadcrumbs, purchases, messages, behavioral tells, but Rita had none, and that led some investigators to consider a different possibility. Maybe this wasn't just a disappearance, maybe it was a removal. In missing persons investigations, there comes a point where evidence runs thin, but suspicion thickens. By April 2018, the Gutierrez-Garcia case had entered that phase. There was no active crime scene, no forensic markers to follow, and no confirmed suspect. But inside the Longmont Police Department, something was shifting, quietly and with growing tension. A few weeks after Rita's disappearance, a name began circulating internally, not officially, not through warrants or subpoenas, but through comments off the record from several women who came forward after community outreach expanded. They described a man, not by name but by pattern, inappropriate behavior at bars, persistence that turned to harassment, and according to one woman, threats made when she refused a ride. He wasn't listed in the initial witness reports from March 17th, but investigators had reason to believe he was present at Threes that night. They pulled historical incident reports from local agencies and ran a name match through internal databases. A partial vehicle match to the white pickup truck seen on grainy surveillance footage helped narrow the search, and eventually, one identity surfaced. He had no active warrants in Colorado, but in a neighboring state, he had been recently charged, pending trial, for a violent assault against a woman. Same MO. Met at a bar, initiated contact, became aggressive when denied. The alleged victim in that case survived. In Longmont, investigators couldn't act on that case, but they documented the pattern. Still, no forensic evidence linked him to Rita, and without it, no search warrant could be justified. They had no recovered property from Rita, no phone, no clothing fragment, no trace DNA that could be processed. This wasn't stonewalling, it was legal constraint. Law enforcement can't build a case on instincts. Still, detectives monitored his location. They confirmed he'd left the state shortly after Rita went missing, and they noted that after leaving, he didn't return, not for months. Meanwhile, the white truck remained a focus. Detectives reviewed hours of camera footage from businesses along the potential travel path that matched the final phone ping. But footage was spotty. A used car lot had a broken system. A chain restaurant facing the main road hadn't retained their recordings. An auto shop with exterior cams had power failure logs. One camera, however, positioned at a nearby warehouse, captured a white pickup truck turning into a non-public access road at 2:45 a.m. The timestamp aligned too closely with Rita's last digital signal to ignore. Unfortunately, due to lighting and angle, the license plate wasn't visible, and the footage wasn't detailed enough to confirm make or model. but the location matched the general direction Rita's phone had traveled. Officers canvassed the area. The warehouse lot was secured by a private lease, and without probable cause or owner consent, entry wasn't an option. No objects were found along the fence perimeter. The field nearby was dry, undisturbed. No tire imprints deep enough to trace. The clean landscape frustrated the team. One detective put it plainly, "It's like someone knew where to go to stay invisible." By May, the investigation stalled. Leads had slowed. Surveillance footage had been exhausted. Digital records showed no new data points. Rita's phone remained off, inactive. No data recovery was possible without the physical device. The man police quietly tracked still wasn't named in public documents. No arrest had been made. His history remained circumstantial. But to the investigators working the case, the direction felt increasingly focused. They just couldn't prove it. Frustration grew beyond law enforcement. In the community, suspicion spread. Rumors circulated online. Names were thrown out without evidence. Volunteers continued organizing search days, but turnout thinned as hope faded. What made the case more difficult was its ambiguity. If it had been violent, loud, messy, chaotic, someone would have noticed. But instead, Rita disappeared in a silence so complete, even science couldn't penetrate it. One forensic analyst involved later said, "When there's nothing, it's not just absence, it can be design." That idea, that absence could be manufactured, was what kept detectives from closing the case. They didn't find Rita, not a trace. But in cases like this, you don't always need to find the victim first. Sometimes you start with the man who stayed behind. As the search for Rita Gutierrez Garcia stalled and public pressure escalated, the Longmont Police Department quietly shifted focus. While drones scanned ravines and volunteers posted flyers, detectives were combing through phone records, surveillance footage, and background checks, not for Rita, but for a name that kept resurfacing: Juan Figueroa. Figueroa wasn't some nameless drifter. He lived in the same general area. He had a documented criminal record that included multiple violent offenses against women, a 2017 conviction for second-degree assault, a 2012 incident involving unlawful sexual contact. He had a clear pattern, and investigators were taking notice. More than once, people in Rita's social circle brought up Juan, not as a boyfriend or someone especially close, but as a man who'd been hovering in her orbit the night she vanished. It was enough to warrant further scrutiny. The real break came when detectives examined geolocation data from cell towers and vehicle tracking systems. Though Rita's phone had gone dark around 3:17 a.m. on March 18, 2018, Juan's didn't. His movements in the critical early morning hours put him in proximity to downtown Longmont, and then heading west toward isolated, undeveloped terrain. They also retrieved surveillance footage from nearby businesses. There, in a grainy clip, a man closely resembling Juan Figueroa walked through a lot near the last confirmed location of Rita. The timestamp aligned with the window in which she disappeared. But this wasn't enough. Not for a no-body homicide case, so the team kept digging. They looked at Juan's vehicle, an older model sedan. A warrant was filed for data pulled from the car's onboard diagnostics. Investigators tracked odometer changes, fuel consumption, and idle times, hoping to piece together movement patterns. The forensic report noted a period of stationary idling in an off-grid location, approximately 26 miles from Longmont. No clear reason to stop there. No known contacts in the area. And there was one more thing. A statement Juan made to an acquaintance shortly after Rita vanished. The words weren't a confession, but they were careless. When asked whether he'd heard the news, Juan reportedly said, "That girl, yeah, I think she took off. Wouldn't be surprised if they find her bones someday." It was too specific, too cold. Detectives documented the quote, then compared it with other interactions. Juan hadn't filed a missing person report. He hadn't participated in searches. And when brought in for a voluntary interview, his timeline was vague. "I don't remember. I went home. Maybe I stopped for gas." For a man who claimed to know nothing, he suddenly couldn't stop giving uncertain answers. Still, no body, no blood, no confession. Prosecutors were hesitant. It was still 2018. The DA needed more than proximity, record, and instinct. They needed something that held in court. And so, just as quietly as they started, investigators began building what's known as a circumstantial homicide case. They compiled patterns, inconsistencies, behavioral red flags. Every time Juan changed his story, they documented it. Every data point was a pixel in a picture they were trying to render. A woman gone, a man unaccounted for, and a crime scene that refused to show itself. There was no smoking gun. Not yet, but there was smoke, and it was rising from one direction. The investigation into Rita Gutierrez Garcia's disappearance had stalled for months. The tips dried up. Witness statements contradicted one another. The initial canvass yielded no physical evidence, no blood, no personal belongings, no known struggle. But the Longmont Police Department knew this. Someone had taken Rita, and whoever it was hadn't counted on the persistent evolution of digital forensics. By mid-2019, a specialized task force was formed to reevaluate the case through every available digital avenue. High on the list was the examination of geolocation metadata, cell tower pings, and surveillance traffic pattern mapping from that early morning on March 18, 2018. Investigators began with what they did have, a narrowed window. Rita was last seen just after 2:30 a.m. Leaving the bar district on Main Street, her last known location pinged near a downtown alley. She vanished within minutes. No further activity on her phone, no bank transactions, no confirmed sightings. At using historical cell site data, detectives retriangulated known users in the area within a 30-minute radius of the last ping. One name resurfaced, Juan Antonio Figueroa. At first glance, he had already been dismissed. He'd told police he'd gone home after the bars closed. He lived out of town and had no known relationship with Rita, beyond casual acquaintance. But when detectives pulled historical vehicle data using regional license plate readers, something didn't add up. Juan's white 2001 Ford Explorer had been captured entering Longmont around 1:15 a.m. and leaving roughly 20 minutes after Rita's phone went dark. The return path was inconsistent with a simple route home. There were unexplained stops logged by highway cameras. A forensic analyst retrieved metadata from Google geolocation services tied to Juan's known email account. The results matched his Explorer's route and revealed several areas where the vehicle idled longer than necessary, particularly a remote wooded corridor between Longmont and Left-Hand Canyon. It wasn't proof of murder, but it was proof that Juan had lied. He was in the vicinity of Rita's last known location. He had time, motive, and a known criminal record that included domestic assault. Police quietly launched a covert surveillance operation. Juan had relocated to Texas. While they monitored his movements, they filed multiple warrants, one for vehicle records, another for any cloud-stored data. One especially damning find. In the days following Rita's disappearance, Juan had searched for terms involving decomposition rates, remote burial, and how long before DNA degrades in soil. Still, no body had been recovered. No weapon. No confession. Investigators were building a circumstantial case with strong digital bones, but the absence of physical remains kept it incomplete. Then came a break in late 2020. A construction crew working utility upgrades near a dirt road outside Left-Hand Canyon unearthed skeletal remains wrapped in plastic sheeting, buried shallowly near a dry creek bed. A silver necklace, still intact, was found beneath the collarbone. Dental records confirmed what her family had long feared. The body was Rita's. The autopsy revealed multiple signs of blunt force trauma to the skull. The damage was consistent with a heavy object. Bone fractures suggested she had been attacked from behind. Forensic entomology helped place the time of death within hours of her disappearance. When the remains were tested for trace DNA, the analysis was slow but definitive. Microscopic traces of epithelial tissue and degraded blood fragments, consistent with Juan's DNA, were found on the inside of the plastic wrap and around one of the zip ties used to bind her ankles. At this point, the task force had enough. Though the case had been cold for nearly 3 years, the combination of digital tracking, surveillance footage, search history, and now physical DNA evidence allowed the DA to move forward with charges. On October 5, 2021, a sealed indictment was issued. Juan Figueroa was arrested in Texas and extradited to Colorado. It wasn't just the ending the Gutierrez Garcia family had waited for. It was the beginning of legal reckoning for a killer who thought the world would forget. The date was April 28, 2021. The coordinates were specific: an undeveloped stretch of land near the 1000 block of Lower River Road outside of Longmont, Colorado. It was a utility excavation crew working on a sewer line extension that first made contact with human remains. What they initially believed to be an animal skeleton embedded in the soil turned out to be something else entirely. Upon further clearing, the outline of a human skull and pelvic structure became unmistakable. The Boulder County Coroner's Office, along with Longmont police and forensic anthropologists, was called to the scene. From the start, the location's geographic isolation posed challenges. There were no cameras, no direct witnesses, but investigators had one advantage now they hadn't had in 2018: context. The skeletal remains were consistent with a female, approximate height and age, matching Rita Gutierrez Garcia, missing since March 18, 2018. She had last been seen near the downtown bar district. Her disappearance had sparked numerous search efforts across the city, but none had reached this undeveloped corridor before. It wasn't a random spot, it was chosen. And the choice said something. Forensic teams recovered partial remains, clothing fragments, and a single shoe. A dental comparison was immediately ordered. DNA from the femur and molars was extracted and rushed for comparison against known family samples stored from the 2018 investigation. Less than 72 hours later, the identity was confirmed. The remains were Rita's. The autopsy could not determine a precise cause of death due to advanced decomposition. There were no surviving organs, no visible trauma to the bones. But what was telling was the burial. It was shallow, less than 2 feet deep, and covered haphazardly. There were no signs of ritual, concealment, or panic. It was clinical, efficient, and by someone familiar with the area. From a law enforcement standpoint, this wasn't a fresh homicide investigation. It was a reactivation of an unresolved case, now with a body. And with that, Longmont PD could legally escalate their efforts, especially against the prime suspect already under watch, Juan Figueroa. As investigators revisited the 2018 records, several connections came into tighter focus. Figueroa's location data on the night of March 18, 2018, had shown movement north of Longmont between 3 o'clock a.m. and 4:30 a.m., an unexplained window that aligned with the grave's location. At the time, the data had been circumstantial, but now, knowing where Rita's remains were found, that geolocation trail became damning. Furthermore, the excavation site matched Figueroa's previous employment area. He had done construction subcontracting in the vicinity in 2016 and 2017. That explained his knowledge of the off-road access, which had no signage and remained invisible on most mapping services. Detectives returned to analyze cell tower triangulation in greater depth. The 2018 ping data showed Rita's phone losing signal abruptly around 2:38 a.m., followed by Juan's phone briefly leaving the coverage zone before reconnecting near the River Road coordinates. While this data was previously inconclusive without a crime scene, it now tightened the noose. And there was one more element investigators reevaluated: an anonymous call from late 2019. The caller had referenced a dig site north of town and mentioned a girl who disappeared near Main Street. At the time, the tip had been discarded due to lack of specificity, but now, in light of the exact discovery zone, detectives flagged that recording again. Prosecutors, in coordination with Longmont detectives and the DA's office, determined that they now had enough to move forward with a murder charge. The challenge remained that the body showed no fatal injuries. But prosecutors aimed to argue homicide based on the combination of circumstantial and digital evidence: the location of the grave, Juan's cell data, his criminal history with violent offenses against women, and his unaccounted movements on the night Rita disappeared. In parallel, authorities quietly filed paperwork to transfer Juan Figueroa, already serving time in Nevada for an unrelated assault case, to Colorado custody. But before they moved forward publicly, they needed to build an airtight digital reconstruction of March 18, 2018. Every call, every app use, every movement in that 12-hour window would be reprocessed through modern tools unavailable in 2018. The recovery of Rita's remains marked not just a forensic milestone, but a shift in strategy. What had once been a missing persons file without a trace was now a confirmed homicide. And what had once been speculation was forming into a timeline with fixed coordinates and data points, points that would soon corner a suspect already tethered to her final night. By mid-2022, over a year since Rita's remains were recovered from a shallow ravine near Left Hand Canyon, the Longmont Police Department, in coordination with Boulder County investigators, had shifted focus to forensic consolidation. The suspect, Juan Figueroa, already in custody for an unrelated sexual assault, was no longer just a person of interest. He was the only viable suspect. The forensic unit had been working under pressure. The body, badly decomposed and partially buried, had yielded limited biological evidence. However, the DNA swab recovered from under Rita's fingernails proved viable. The match with Figueroa was confirmed through CODIS, with a probability of error considered statistically negligible. Alongside the DNA, investigators began to reconstruct the final movements of both Rita and Figueroa through digital breadcrumbs. Figueroa's Dodge Charger had been equipped with a built-in navigation system. With the aid of a warrant and cooperation from the manufacturer, the GPS logs from March 17, 2018 were extracted and analyzed. The route data showed the vehicle leaving the vicinity of the downtown bar where Rita was last seen, then traveling west toward the canyon area around 3:14 a.m. The car remained stationary in a remote turnout along Left-Hand Canyon Drive for approximately 42 minutes before returning eastward. Investigators interpreted this gap as critical. The time frame coincided with Rita's disappearance and allowed for the possibility of a struggle, homicide, and the concealment of her body. Though the defense would later argue that GPS records alone could not prove who was in the car or what happened during those 42 minutes, this data was no longer isolated. It was being connected to other findings. One pivotal link came from cellular tower triangulation. Rita's phone had stopped transmitting any signal at approximately 3:21 a.m. within the canyon's coverage shadow. Additionally, the area where her remains were eventually located had no signal, supporting the theory that the phone was either destroyed or intentionally disabled near the disposal site. The last active ping aligned within 900 meters of the Dodge Charger's recorded location. Further, Figueroa's own phone had been turned off between 2:57 a.m. and 4:03 a.m. That night, an anomaly in his usage pattern. In the weeks leading up to March 17th, his records showed near-constant phone activity throughout the day and night. The sudden blackout, coinciding with the disappearance and body disposal timeframe, created a timeline inconsistency that the prosecution would later highlight as indicative of premeditation or, at minimum, an attempt to avoid traceability. During this period, detectives also revisited older incidents in Figueroa's past, particularly those involving harassment, stalking, and threats toward women. While these incidents had not led to formal charges at the time, they demonstrated a consistent behavioral pattern. One of his ex-girlfriends described him as obsessive and violent when rejected. Another woman had filed a restraining order after he allegedly followed her home and threatened her for not returning his messages. Though circumstantial, these statements provided context for understanding the risk Rita might have unknowingly faced that night. By early August 2022, a digital forensic analyst on the task force uncovered a cloud-based audio file backed up from Figueroa's personal device. It had been mislabeled and overlooked during earlier reviews. The recording captured ambient sound from the early hours of March 18th. While mostly distorted, forensic enhancement revealed faint audio markers, a woman's voice yelling, "No!" followed by heavy breathing and shuffling. The timestamp matched the window during which Figueroa's vehicle had been parked in the canyon. When presented with this in an interview, Figueroa offered no explanation. His counsel, present during the interview, advised him to remain silent. There was still no eyewitness, no camera footage directly capturing the act, but each strand of evidence, from GPS to DNA to behavioral history, was aligning with increasing precision. The case was transforming from a circumstantial structure into a narrative with converging facts. As investigators moved toward building a prosecutable timeline, they continued cross-referencing every digital move. They knew the defense would attempt to challenge each point individually. Their strategy, therefore, was to make sure no piece stood alone. Each had to corroborate another. The burden of proof, especially in a no-witness delayed body recovery case, would demand nothing less. Before charges were formally filed, a final piece was secured. Soil samples recovered from the undercarriage of Figueroa's vehicle in 2018, retained by Crime Lab protocol, were tested against sediment from the burial site. A match was confirmed. Same mineral composition, same fungal spores. The physical link between the suspect's vehicle and the remote canyon was established. The case was ready, By May 2022, the case that had haunted Longmont for 4 years reached its legal end. After leading investigators to Rita's buried remains in Left-Hand Canyon through a jailhouse confession, Juan Figueroa was formally charged with second-degree murder. The recovery, confirmed via dental records, matched his own directions. GPS data from his vehicle and DNA found under Rita's fingernails had already narrowed the circle. This sealed it. The confession came during a federal prison proffer session, not in open court. It was a strategic move. In exchange for truth, Figueroa received a plea deal, 48 years in the Colorado Department of Corrections, handed down on October 5, 2023. There was no trial, no motive explained, but the body was recovered. The killer was sentenced. Inside the courtroom, Diane Romero, Rita's mother, delivered a statement that cut through the legal formality. "You buried my daughter like she was trash," she said. But she was our entire world. There was no autopsy conclusion. Rita's cause of death could not be definitively established due to decomposition. Still, investigators were clear. She was murdered, and Juan Figueroa, a man with a violent past, had both the opportunity and the knowledge no one else did. Since then, the Gutierrez-Garcia family has focused on advocacy for missing women, for faster response systems, and for cold case funding. Rita's name now stands not only as a tragedy, but a warning. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive with flashing lights or dramatic courtroom scenes. Sometimes it shows up quietly, through tireless investigation, GPS logs, DNA traces, and a mother's unshakable resolve. What happened to Rita Gutierrez-Garcia is a tragedy no family should endure, but her story reminds us, silence is not safety, and disappearance is not absence. If this video spoke to you, leave a comment. What would you want communities to do better for missing women? Where are you watching from? And if it didn't resonate, tell me why. I want to hear all sides. If you believe in true crime stories told with purpose, heart, and truth, subscribe now so you won't miss the next one. Stay safe, stay aware, and never stop asking the right questions.